It's a windy old thing. You know, you start way up in the headwaters in Delaware, and it looks like any old creek in the woods, shallow, coming together from a number of different places, like fingers of a hand. And then it begins to gather speed and depth and width and starts moving out through Seaford, Delaware, and on down. And then it suddenly changes to something that's entirely different from where it started in Delaware. It's broad, wide, flat, and there's wide expanses of marsh on either side, and there's a whole different feel to the river. It starts out as fresh water and ends up as salt water. It starts out in one state, ends up in another. It starts out with one habitat and ends up with another. And I like that.
Going into a heron rookery is like going back in time. If you go into the rookery when the young are in the nest, they're making all sorts of primeval sounds, these constant cackling sounds. And then when you have, like 1,000 nests, it's pretty startling. So it's an unusual place to visit because of the herons present, all the noise that's going on, the smells, the herons flying around. It's a very active environment. And of course you're out in the middle of wilderness too at this rookery. And so you get to enjoy the quiet and peacefulness of a forest, and then, get the opportunity to see these herons up close.
I was born and raised in this area. I've lived here all my life, and I used to go out on the creek. Even as a young kid, I'd ride up and down in my boat and fish and explore, and it was just a great place to go. You just loved going there. Even at that age, I just sensed that there was something special about it. You hear nothing but birds and frogs, and it's a nice place to visit, just to go out to enjoy nature. When you first start, you've got pretty much covered canopy. You've got mostly maples, gums, and cypress, but the cypress aren't quite as obvious at first. And then as you go down, about halfway down to Nanticoke Creek Road, it starts opening up a little bit, and you get a little bit more tidal influence. You get some freshwater marshes appearing, and you start seeing a lot more large cypress trees. There's a rule of thumb that it's about 100 years old for each foot in diameter. I know there's several trees along the creek that are probably 3 feet in diameter, so that's roughly 200 to 300 years old. And there are a few that are much older than that.
Silent Hill Creek is about as close to pristine as you can get for a river in this part of the Appalachians. It still has free-flowing water, there's no dams, there's no channelization. The creek looks just like it did pretty much 150, 200 years ago. The stream is still forested along the sides. Most of the surrounding landscape is still forested. There's only a small amount of farmland in the watershed. Most of the species that one would expect along Silent Hill Creek are still there. Pristine is the word to describe it. The shorelines of the creek include some really interesting Appalachian-type ecosystems like the shale barrens, which are the dry, desert-like ecosystems that support specialized plants like Case Mountain clover that's found only on the shale barrens in the Appalachians and nowhere else on Earth. Once you get into shale country like Silent Hill Creek, a lot of the forests seem to be dead and barren because they're fairly nutrient-poor and acidic. But when you get right down on the floodplain, all of a sudden the forests become much more diverse, much more lush, and it's because of the silt that gets washed in during the floods. It's just so much more nutrient-rich. So you start to see things that like nutrient-rich locations that like a lot of moisture, like the ferns, and like the dwarf-crested iris. And there's a couple species of freshwater mussels at Silent Hill Creek.
I think there's like 14 warblers that nest in the Nanticoke stream corridor. I know there's at least 12 orchids that flower there. And there was this one spot that we found that it was a small bog that was on one of the little feeder streams from Nanticoke Creek. And I think there was like 27 species that were on the rare and endangered list. There's no other place like it in the state for sheer numbers of plants.
I swim in the river, I canoe in the river, I kayak in the river, I sail in the river, and I look at that river every day, sometimes morning, noon, and night. It's just this constant source of inspiration.
I feel like it's a refuge. I feel like it's one place I can get to pretty quick from where I live and get out in a canoe or a kayak and just be completely alone and find a little renewal. It's a lovely spot for that. Just go travel in a skiff or a kayak down some of these winding marsh creeks or up in the wooded swamps. Once you get out of sight of town, you're almost in wilderness for a while. That's probably its prime value to me now, just being able to get away to a place where you aren't always turning a corner and saying, oh God, another farm that's gone up in houses, or geez, I didn't know they were going to cut those trees down. I find that river corridor seems to be a place that's been protected. You can get away from that a little bit. It's quite rare for this part of the world, here within a couple hours of Baltimore and Washington, and 3.5 hours from New York and all of New Jersey, and not that far from Connecticut. Very rare in the center of all that population to have a river left where you can paddle your canoe or run your skiff for 3 or 4 hours and 95% of that time see just woods or marsh with very little trace of development.
Well, at one time, all stream systems in Appalachia and in Maryland were high-quality streams. They had good water quality, they had their original flows, they had their original suite of plants and animals that were supposed to be there. And through time, more and more and more of the streams have been degraded, and fewer really nice, high-quality ones remained. And we're down to the point today that there are very few of these high-quality streams left. And they serve not only as a reference point for us to know what is good water quality, what is a healthy stream like, but it's also going to be one of the few reference points in the future for future generations to also know those exact same things.
A lot of people around here think the Nanticoke is just fine the way it is. Why don't you leave it alone? But I think people who feel that way just don't see what's inevitable. And the population is moving in. We can't stop that from coming. So we've got to deal with it head on in a way that's going to show some foresight and manage the growth that is inevitable in a responsible way. Alongside of that, we've got this river that is one of the cleanest rivers that flows into the Chesapeake Bay, and you can't look at the Nanticoke in a vacuum. You've got to look at the Nanticoke and its relationship to the wildlife and the people and the future and its relationship to the Chesapeake Bay. I think if we work hard to protect what we have now, we won't be sorry later on. We won't have to go back and fix it. And that's always so much harder.
I think it's more and more important in regions like this to have some places where you can get away in countryside landscape like it used to be. I mean, it's also quite important to still have some large connected segments of forest and marsh and water for wildlife. I mean, a lot of these eagles that we see around where I live are not here because of the farmland or the developments. We may see them there and enjoy them there, but they're there because there are some rivers like the Nanticoke keeping their habitat intact. That's where they nest. I think places like that are fairly rare now and bound to get even rarer.
There's been a lot of development, especially along the coastal areas, and it's just a matter of time before the development spreads inland, and we're very scared of the fact that any high land that's along Nanticoke Creek will eventually be cleared and made a housing project. There's only so much money around to throw after these places. You know, you want to save everything that's still semi-natural, but you can't. And what you have to do is to save the best of what's left.
We should be good stewards of the land, and not only the land itself, but the plants and animals that live there. And if we don't set aside places or preserves for birds such as these that need quiet and solitude during the nesting season, we're going to lose them. An Indian might lose their colony to somewhere else, and then they may get chased from there somewhere else. So eventually there won't be somewhere else to go. I think they have as much a right to this planet as we do.